so far the little Ducati is coming along quite nicely, but we're into the realms of waiting for bits now, so I can crack on and do little bits like clean the brakes, bleed them up, chase a couple of the electrical, I think irregularities would be the best term for the fact that some of the stuff's wired up the wrong way around. Generally give it a bit of TLC on the bits that sometimes just get left. As this bike had actually been ridden in previous life, quite a lot of the fasteners had probably gone rusty, so the previous owner had very, very nicely replaced lots and lots of bits with stainless steel, which looks nicer, lasts longer, gives the bike a real nice fresh appearance. But brakes, of course, only work properly if they're maintained well. So the important bit is down here, you can't really see it, where the pistons and pads are. So today we're going to take them apart and have a proper look. I have a very specific and probably utterly dull way of arranging everything when I take brake calipers apart. So what I've got is the bolts and the pad pins in order, and the pads in order of how I took them out. So I know this pad is on the outside of the caliper, this one's on the inside, that bolt is the one from the sort of top of the caliper. Now, the bolts probably don't really matter so much, but with the pads, you want to put the pads back in the same point in the caliper, because, as you can see on the discs, there's sort of really minor little imperfections on the discs. Now, that's sort of fairly normal. So, obviously the pad has to bed to the disc. So, if you put them back the wrong way round, it's got to bed in a second time. So you're better off putting them back in the same place. Now we can see inside the caliper itself, and the pistons are, I can't see any corrosion on them, but they are a little bit dirty, so it's obviously worth giving them a proper clean. Now what you'll see is I'm about to push the brake lever. I'm going to push it with my head because I'm holding the camera with my other hand, and you should see the pistons moving slightly. And that's exactly what we want to see. This piston's moving first, so one by one I'll sort of hold that in place, pump the others out a little bit, and what I want is them all just a few millimetres out from their normal position. Then I'll give them a good scrub with some brake cleaner and a toothbrush, put some lubricant, some red rubber grease around them, and and then push them gently back in by hand, and we'll have a look at it when I've got them somewhere near. That's all the pistons pumped out a little bit. Now I'm going to get in there with my finest toothbrush and some brake cleaner, and hopefully make the thing look a little bit nicer. Right, that's the first caliper pistons cleaned. Hopefully you can see the pistons themselves are nice and clean. There's a little bit of stone marking and bits on them in place, but nowhere particularly critical for where the seals are going to run. Now, I can't get all of the old brake dust out of the calipers because some of it's been in there 20 years and has sort of eaten its way into the anodising. What I don't want to do is scrub too hard and take the anodising off. So the important bit though is the pistons, and they're nice and clean now. So I'm going to apply some red rubber grease, which is proper high temperature brake stuff, and then push the pistons back one by one so that the lubricant gets into the seals. Now on a race bike I use GT85 to just a little dribble of GT85 on each piston and push the piston back, because on a race bike you're checking the brakes every day because you want to check the pads anyway, and if you're doing them every day it only takes a couple of minutes to whip the pads out, clean and re-lube the pistons, make sure everything's working perfectly. On a road bike, obviously you're not going to be doing this every time you ride the bike, so red rubber grease is a little bit better for keeping the weather out, so we use that on road bikes, not necessarily on race bikes. Now you can see on the bench how much dirt's come out of the caliper, and as I was toothbrushing all the dirt off, some of it gets on the discs and bits and sprays around, so I've given the discs a bit of a rub over with brake cleaner. That's the pistons all greased up and pushed back. Now they should push back into the caliper just with your fingers. If it needs any more than that, you've probably got an issue with your seals or your pistons. What tends to happen is damp and dirt get under the seals and corrodes the seal, and then the seal pushes down because the corrosion's sort of behind it. The piston pushes down on the piston, and the piston doesn't move freely, because that's what that's supposed to mean. So if they don't push back easily by hand, you've probably got bigger problems and you need to do a bit more investigating. That's the pads refitted. All I do with the pads is give them a bit of a rub over with a stiff stainless steel wire brush that I don't use for anything else but brake calipers. That just breaks any glaze up, clears any sort of loose brake dust and bits out, and then just give them a blast with some brake cleaner. Then I put a little smear of copper grease on the pad pins, just so they don't stick in the caliper body. And then when you put the anti-squeal plate on, just check the arrow is pointing in the normal disc rotation direction. Now, some people smear anti-squeal paste or copper slip on the back of the pad. I've never really felt the need myself. If your brakes do squeal, you can put a bit on the back, but it's fairly rare, so I don't tend to bother. So that's caliper number 1 refitted and torqued up. Now I'll just pump the lever up. That should pump the pads out that you probably can't. In fact, you just see that piston moved. That's pumped that out. We've got a proper nice brake lever. First one done. I'll go and do the second one now. Now that the calipers are clean, the next job is to put new fluid in everything. Now, the basic idea of brakes is you're changing kinetic energy into heat energy, and obviously quite a lot of the heat gets transferred into the brake fluid. So when people complain the brakes are fading, what's happening is the brake fluid's actually boiling, and all the little water bubbles in the caliper, when it starts boiling, obviously they compress easier than the fluid itself, so you lose braking ability. So what we're going to be using today is Motul .4 brake fluid. .3, .4. Nowadays everything's .4, but it's compatible with the .3 system, so it says .3 and 4 on it. What I use in my race bikes is this higher temperature stuff, because that doesn't boil until 660 degrees Fahrenheit. So that is a little bit overkill for a road bike. This .3, .4 stuff is more than good enough, so that's what we're going to be using today. The actual system we use for bleeding brakes is relatively simple. Obviously we've got the top off the reservoir there. What happens is when I push on here, that's pushing a piston into a little cylinder, the master cylinder, and that forces the fluid down the lines and pushes the pistons out so they clamp the disc like that. What we do is, when we undo the bleed nipple here, it's got a little hole in the bottom on a taper. When we open that, instead of it pushing the pads out, the pressure from the mass cylinder pushes the fluid out of the caliper. So what I do is apply a little bit of pressure at the lever, like so. Then with my other hand, I'll crack the bleed nipple open, let the pressure fluid go out, and then I'll lock the nipple off again before I release the lever. That way it has to pull the next bit of fluid from the reservoir, as opposed to just pulling it back around the pipe. Now, it takes a little bit of doing. Once you've done it a few times, it's easy enough. Do both calipers, and then I'll come back to you. That's it, front brakes complete. The fluid level doesn't need to be brim full to the absolute top, because obviously if it gets hot it wants maybe a little room to expand, so I tend to have them sort of halfway between your marks on there. Everything clean. Make sure you have a little bit of a wipe around, make sure there's no fluid anywhere, because it will strip paint if you leave it on anything. Right, that's all the front brakes done. They feel spot on. So now it's time to do exactly the same job on the back. In general, this Ducati is about the cleanest bike I've ever actually bought second hand, and considering that it's been fairly well used over the years, that, kudos to the last owner for meticulously cleaning it. There's just a few little bits inside the swinging arm and bits where you can't get to it normally, so I'm just going to give them a little bit of a clean and you know, then go and do something more interesting. Other than a bit of chaining here and there, she's not bad at all. But a little bit of run around with some degreaser, she'll come up like new. That's looking considerably cleaner in there. I've given the chain a nice clean as well. So that's all looking good. Now the swinging arm's actually got a bit of damage on it. But there's nothing else on the rest of the bike that makes me think that it's crash damage from this bike. I'm actually wondering whether maybe at some point they've maybe had the bearings in here have maybe failed, because it's not uncommon if these bolts are over tightened, it nips the bearing up and damages it. So I'm wondering maybe at some point whether it's actually had the swinging arm replaced in it. As you can see, there's a bit of damage in there as well, possibly from a snap chain or something. But structurally, I'll say it properly, it's okay. So I'm not going to worry greatly about it at this stage. When I picked the bike up, I noticed it had a very strange thing that when you started it, the oil light stayed on until you put it in gear. But the neutral light went off straight away, which, you know, was fairly obvious to me that the neutral light and the oil pressure sensor were wired up the wrong way round. And it seems that I found the reason why. These connectors, that one and this one, they actually fit into the same plug, and that one's now connected hopefully correctly as the neutral one, and this is the oil pressure light. So when I refit the engine cover, everything should work correctly. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you're all now nicely fast asleep. Join us again next time when we'll be doing something that might be more interesting, if some parts have turned up.